Alrighty, hello everybody. Welcome to the formation, history, and importance of peat bogs with Geoffrey the giant elk and me, of course, Miss Bree. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Miss Bree. I'm an educator, a farmer, an illustrator, a singer, and very much a proud grammar nerd, thank you. So welcome to the farm school by my farm, the Heirloom Farm LLC. So on our farm, we believe that using animals and stories and fun and real life scenarios help things make more sense. So let's go. All right, so peat bogs are ancient landscapes of water and carbon and mystery. So long ago, when enormous antlers stretched wide across the northern sky, Geoffrey, the giant Irish elk, walked the damp edges of ancient wetlands. And beneath his hooves, something extraordinary was forming, layer by layer, century by century. He didn't know it then, but he was walking across the beginning of peat bogs. He might say, I remember how soft the ground felt. It held secrets even then. Okay, and we're going to move on and we're going to learn about things. And Geoffrey down here in the left is going to tell us. But one thing I want you to remember is that Geoffrey, the giant Irish elk, is an extinct species, okay? So we pulled him out just for this video. So what is a peat bog? Well, a peat bog is a special kind of wetland where water gathers and stays. In these places, plants grow, die, and fall into waterlogged soil. But instead of fully decomposing, they remain partially preserved. Over thousands of years, these layers build up into peat, a thick, dark, carbon-rich material formed from ancient plant remains. It's like the earth is keeping a diary, okay? Every layer tells a story. So how do peat bogs form, and how do you know what they are? Well, before Geoffrey ever even roamed the earth, massive glaciers shaped the lands, okay? These rivers of ice carved deep depressions into the landscape. When the glaciers melted and retreated, those depressions filled with water. Okay, so it's like when you walk in the mud, sometimes you leave footprints, and then when it rains, your footprints fill with water. This is the same thing. Okay, those glaciers left really big footprints, and now they're filling with water. And the water stayed. That land remained really saturated. So these glacial basins became perfect cradles for peat formation. So the ice came first, and without it, the bogs would never have been born. Peat bogs thrive in cool, wet climates. Frequent rainfall keeps the ground saturated, and poor drainage prevents water from escaping. Because the soil remains constantly soaked, oxygen struggles to enter. And without oxygen, decomposition slows dramatically. This slow decay allows organic material to accumulate instead of disappearing. Time often feels slower in a bog. So, almost as if the world is holding its breath, because it's like a memory box for plants, animals, people, anything that falls into a bog. One small but powerful plant plays a starring role in peat formation: sphagnum moss. Did you know that when you see peat moss or sphagnum peat moss in the like Home Depot or Lowe's or any sort of gardening store, it's from this? Sphagnum can hold extraordinary amounts of water. It also releases natural acids that make the environment even more resistant to decay. As it grows and dies, it becomes part of the accumulating peat, building the bog upward like a living sponge. It's a tiny little plant, but it shapes entire landscapes. Isn't that cool? It's the tiniest little plant, but it is the whole reason that peat bogs exist. So the key to peat formation is the absence of oxygen. And this is what scientists call anaerobic conditions. Okay. In waterlogged soil, which means very, very waterlogged means you're saturated. You're so full of water that you're like drowning, right? Oxygen cannot circulate freely in this soil. Microorganisms that usually break down plant matter and plant material cannot function normally. So, as a result, plants decompose only partially. Their remains are stacked in layers, okay, and they just keep stacking, forming peat over hundreds and thousands of years. So it's preservation through patience. Nothing in a bog happens quickly. Everything is slow. Okay? It is a very patient a very patient formation, okay? Imagine it like a historian. They have to go through and keep all of their artifacts in good condition, but it takes them months and months to restore paintings and artifacts and things. This is the same thing, okay? A peat bog is like a historian for the earth. So for centuries, people harvested dried peat as a fuel source, especially in places where wood was scarce. But peatlands offer something even more powerful: carbon storage. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they grow. When they die in bogs, that carbon becomes locked away in peat rather than released back into the air. Okay, peatlands are among the planet's most important carbon sinks. They protect the sky, and if they're disturbed, the sky will remember, okay? Dried peat has been used as fuel for centuries. So, for instance, where Geoffrey comes from, in Ireland, there are people that have used dried peat for fuel for fires as long as memory goes back. Okay, so for as long as there's been people in Ireland, there has been dried peat being used for fuel. Okay, and in Ireland, one of the biggest places is called the Bog of Allen. We're going to learn about that. Okay, so by protecting peatlands, it helps to regulate the climate. So now let's move on to the geographic distribution of peat bogs. Where are they? Peat bogs are common in glaciated regions. This means places shaped by glaciers, okay? So Northern Europe, Canada, Russia, Ireland, Britain, those sorts of places. Okay, the landscape shaped by ancient ice combined with cool climates create ideal conditions for peat to accumulate. These are the very regions where Geoffrey once roamed. Okay? He would recognize the wind and the rain and the mist. Isn't that cool? But not all peatlands are cold. In tropical regions like Malaysia, Indonesia, and even parts of South America, peat forms beneath dense forests. Okay? Unlike moss-dominated northern bogs, tropical peatlands are filled with trees and complex root systems. So despite the warmth, they still accumulate enormous carbon reserves. They're different forests and different vegetation, but they still have the same slow heartbeat beneath them, okay? They still do the same thing. They're still major global carbon storage systems. And why do we have an extinct animal as our helper for this video? Why is historical significance such a thing that we need to care about? Well, we're going to learn. Okay, so number 1, the discovery of bog bodies. So, because of their acidic, oxygen-poor conditions, peat bogs preserve more than plants. In several European bogs, remarkably well-preserved human remains, known as bog bodies, have been discovered. These bodies offer rare glimpses into ancient rituals, clothing, and daily life. Okay, so the chemistry of the peat bog preserves that organic material. So in the bogs, we've found people with their clothing still intact and all sorts of things that normally would decay and decompose over time, but we've managed to find them in really good condition because of these peat bogs, and that tells us more about what life was like back then. Okay? One famous example is Tollundman, discovered in Denmark. Denmark is one of the Scandinavian countries. Dating back to the Iron Age, his features were preserved with extraordinary clarity. Okay, his peaceful expression allows historians to study burial customs and ancient societies in remarkable detail. Okay, and when they did his facial reconstruction, it looks like he's just sleeping. So, it's amazing to sleep for centuries and still be seen. So next, we're going to move on to the bog iron ore. Peat bogs played a role in early industry as well. Iron minerals accumulated in wetland soils, forming bog iron ore. Ancient communities harvested this iron to create tools and weapons. Thus, peatlands contributed to technological development long before modern mining. It was used for early iron smelting, making knives and spears and things like that. It even supported local economies. So, remember we talked about the Bog of Allen earlier? So, in Ireland lies the Bog of Allen, one of the largest peatlands in Europe. It has supported wildlife, provided fuel, and shaped local culture for centuries. This vast landscape remains a symbol of both ecological richness and environmental challenge. It's historically been used for peat harvesting. So if you look at the picture there, all those little things that look like cobblestones or bricks are actually peat bricks. Okay, they take them and they cut it out and they flip it over and let them dry. And then they come down and collect them. And that's just like using wood for your fire, but they use peat instead. And I think it's amazing that the same winds who swept across these lands millennia ago, thousands of years ago, they're still sweeping across these peatlands today. So, what's the environmental importance and what are threats to our peatlands? Well, number one, peatlands store more carbon per unit area than most forests. Did you know that? Peatlands actually store more carbon than forests. When left intact, they help regulate the global climate. However, when they're drained, harvested, or burned, they release massive amounts of stored carbon dioxide. And that stored carbon dioxide, when it's released, gets into our sky, right? And creates more greenhouse gases up there, which makes our climate warmer. Protecting peatlands is critical for climate stability, okay? So you have to remember what took millennia to build can be undone in a single lifetime if you're not careful. Peatlands function as natural water filters too, just like your water filter in your fridge. So as water moves through layers of moss and peat and everything else that's in there, pollutants and sediments are trapped. The result is much cleaner water flowing into rivers and lakes. Healthy peatlands contribute to healthier ecosystems downstream. And they're just like quiet little workers in the background. They just are little cleaners that work in the background. They don't even ask for applause, even though they deserve it, in my opinion. Peat bogs also support unique plants and animals, specially adapted to acidic, waterlogged conditions. Things like carnivorous plants, Rare birds, insects, and even microorganisms thrive there. The biodiversity of peatlands strengthens the ecosystem's resilience. Okay? You have to remember, life always finds a way, even in the soggiest soil. Today, peatlands face serious threats: peat harvesting, agricultural drainage, land conversion, even tropical deforestation. So, when this happens, when all these things happen, peatlands are damaged. And when they're damaged, remember, stored carbon escapes, biodiversity declines, and therefore the water quality suffers. So, what was once stable becomes fragile. Okay, you have to remember the bog cannot defend itself. It depends on you and your decisions. Why do peat bogs even matter today? You might be wondering. Peat bogs are ancient carbon vaults, water filters, wildlife habitats, and historical archives. They connect the Ice Age, the time when Geoffrey walked the earth, ancient civilizations, and even the modern world together. Their preservation is not merely ecological. It is something called intergenerational responsibility, okay? Intergenerational means multiple generations. So you, your mom, your grandma, your great grandma, even way back to your great 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 grandma. It connects everyone together, okay? So, Geoffrey wants me to tell you that, even though he's long gone, the bogs remain. So make sure you care for them, okay? He's worried that they might disappear. So consider, here's just some discussion questions for you. These are just things to think about, okay? I want you to just go and do some research and think about what you think about these things. Why does oxygen matter so much in decomposition? Okay, which is just an easier way of saying, why do anaerobic conditions preserve organic material? Okay. How do tropical and northern peatlands compare? Find out, what are the differences? What are the similarities? All these different things. Do you think peat should continue to be harvested as fuel, or is there potentially maybe a solution that could help both sides of that coin? And how can modern societies protect these ancient ecosystems? What policies could protect peatlands globally? So, these are just some questions to think about, and I want you to take them and do some research and come up with an answer that you feel comfortable with, okay? From your perspective, what you think the answer should be. And then, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, things like that. All right. So thanks for coming today, guys. I really appreciate you coming, and I'll see you in the next video.